Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, it's truly my pleasure to welcome you to this program with the Honorable Dan Brouillette, Secretary of the U.S. Department of Energy. While I wish we were able to convene in person at Baker Hall, we are glad that we can hold this important event virtually. We are in a time of great national and global uncertainty. To state the obvious, the coronavirus pandemic is truly one of the biggest game changers of our time, not least for how it has shaken and disrupted global energy markets. This has posed a number of questions about how the U.S. should address energy challenges at home and abroad. Despite the difficulties of COVID-19, our Baker Institute centers and programs have continued their data-driven work and have widened their audiences. This is certainly true of our flagship Center for Energy Studies, led by Dr. Ken Medlock. The CES draws on our comparative advantage of being based in the energy capital of the world. In 2019, the CES was ranked as the top energy and resource-based think tank in the world for the third consecutive year, a distinction of which we are justly proud. So since the Baker Institute transitioned to primarily remote operations in March of this year, the CES has held timely and incisive webinars each week on the most pressing energy-related topics. They've truly risen to the occasion during these unorthodox times in an outstanding manner. So the Baker Institute, we endeavor to be a go-to resource for policymakers, and we are honored today that Secretary Brouillette has chosen the Institute and CES as a forum for his address today. So now please join me in welcoming Dr. Ken Medlock to moderate the conversation with Secretary Brouillette. Ken?
Thanks, Ambassador. And it is actually a great pleasure to have you with us, Dan. I'm glad you could make it. Under normal circumstances, it would be an honor to greet you here personally in front of a packed house, I'm sure. 2020 is an adjective unto itself. There's been a lot going on. To say the least. And I actually participated in a panel yesterday at the North American Gas Forum, which is also virtual this year. Normally it's in DC, but the panel discussion was centered on 2020, the year of double black swan events. And to a person on the panel, everybody agreed that it's likely going to be, before all is said and done, more than just two. The ones that people mostly talk about are the oil price shock, that resulted as demand collapsed globally, and we saw prices collapse to levels never seen before. But also the pandemic. Of course, there's a host of other things that have entered into the fray that affect all sorts of things that I know you're going to touch on today, in particular energy and national security. So with that, what I'd like to do is actually hand it over to you. I know you have some opening remarks. Please go ahead and take the floor to deliver those, and then we'll get into some Q&A when you're done.
Well, thank you, Ken. Yeah, thank you, Ken. I really appreciate that, Ambassador. Thank you for that kind introduction as well. It's wonderful to be here with all of you at Rice University. I'm truly honored to have the chance to address the esteemed Baker Institute. And I apologize again that we weren't able to do it in person. Having lived in Texas for many years, I'm always amazed to see the quality of our educational institutions. So I'm grateful for the invitation today, Ken, to share some ideas amongst this distinguished group of faculty and staff. As I was preparing for today, I came across the purpose of the Baker Institute as told by Secretary Baker himself at the Institute's founding. He said that he hoped that the Institute would, and I'll find the quote here somewhere. It's around, there it is right there. He said he hoped the Institute would build a bridge between the world of ideas and the world of action, because Secretary Baker is indeed a man of action. And given this mission statement, this focus on ideas becoming action, what could be more fitting than to talk about the nexus between energy and our national security? Now, the next point that I'd like to make is a bit counterintuitive, but stay with me. Energy is ultimately an idea. You can't touch it. You can't see it. We do extract oil and gas from the earth. We manipulate atoms. We capture the sun's rays to produce energy. But those things are not energy in and of themselves. Probably the best description that we would be able to come up with is that we experience energy. We come home at the end of the day, we flip the light switch on, and there's energy providing you with electricity. And we certainly know what the experience is like when we don't have energy. So energy is an idea, but it's one with the power to influence actions all around the world. If a nation obviously lacks access to energy, they have to take some action, either importing resources or exploring new ways to produce them. Or you can do both, as we've done here from time to time in America. But in our case, we're now the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas, two critical energy resources. And this recent and I think very welcome development has profound implications for our national security. I think we have to acknowledge that we've achieved this enviable position by adhering to the president's pursuit of a true all-of-the-above American energy policy. We've cut taxes, we've cut regulations that were biased against energy production. We've pursued all forms of energy sources and technologies, unleashing American energy dominance. And I do profoundly believe that our nation is the safer for it. In this audience, you understand the seismic shift that this represents. When Secretary Baker was in office, the oil embargoes of the 70s may have been behind us, but we were still heavily dependent on the Middle East for energy. And as I'm sure he would tell you, our foreign policy reflected that reality. Now, fast forward 30 years. As the world's top energy producer, we can pursue our own independent agenda with OPEC and other energy producing nations, as opposed to being beholden to them. Think back to April earlier, about a year ago, almost a year ago now, it feels like, in the height of the pandemic. The Russians and the Saudis found themselves in a dispute that threatened to destabilize the world oil market. And both left a heated meeting with plans to increase production, and in the case of the Saudis, to simultaneously lower prices. Now, this was a bit unusual for the Saudis, who view their position in the world market as providing stability, not instability. And Ken, I was looking through some of your papers and I found the perfect explanation for that. And I'll quote you and a few of your colleagues. You said that normally Saudi Arabia, the world's dominant oil exporter and de facto leader of the OPEC cartel, uses its spare capacity to reduce volatility in oil markets and protect the global economy from a volatile, cyclical industry. In March, however, Saudi officials vowed to deploy spare capacity not to ease volatility, but to exacerbate it. In other words, to launch a price war, unquote. That's from your paper. Now, we know the rest of the story, and I'm sure we'll discuss some of this later today. But in short, President Trump brought these parties together, the Saudis, the Russians, and other producing nations to the table and negotiated a deal to cut production on terms that were favorable to the United States. And because of our global energy supremacy, he was able to do this from a position of strength. Now, our status as a dominant producer also allows us to pursue global energy exports on a level that has never been seen in our history. We currently export LNG to 38 different nations, and our goal is to expand those exports even further. I just recently approved 2 LNG export terminals on the West Coast, which would allow us to reach even more Asian markets. And today, I'm pleased to announce that we've just issued the first 7 LNG export authorization extensions under a new policy that will keep the terms of those agreements in place through the year 2050. This action sends a strong signal that American energy exports will continue to flow around the globe. And while it isn't talked about much, coal is another resource for which there is a tremendous demand all around the world. We export coal to 50 countries, including key allies such as India, Japan, and South Korea. Now, all of our energy exports, LNG, coal, petroleum products, provide energy choice, reliability, and security to our trading partners, and they strengthen our bilateral relationships, which I think serves as a counterbalance to the hegemonic ambitions of countries like China and Russia. I believe strongly that by pursuing a dominant energy production here in the United States at home and promoting energy exports abroad, we're contributing to a more stable, peaceful global order. And our administration is committed to the policies that will grow our energy advantage so that we remain a safe and a prosperous country now and into the future. Thank you, Ken. It's great to be with you. I look forward to our conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Very interesting remarks. It's always nice when you quote Secretary Baker and actually what's on the front of our building. So we're reminded actually of it every day when we walk into work. Couple of questions that sort of immediately come to mind that I'd love to hear you expand on a little bit. Some of which you touched on directly in your remarks. So I'll kind of start there.
Sure.
You mentioned the oil price war. And the significant drop in price, unprecedented volatility, all the things, and you referenced a quote from something I co-authored with a few of my colleagues here at Rice. I think what is sometimes sort of lost in the background of that discussion, I'm wondering if you might be able to expand on this a little bit for our audience, is how the U.S. position from a foreign policy perspective, specifically as it relates to energy, has changed over the last 10 to 12 years. Mm-hmm. This of course touches on other cabinets, State Department as well, but certainly something that's in your purview. So I wonder if you could maybe, from a historical frame of reference, just kind of talk briefly about how that has actually significantly altered U.S. presence in foreign policy discourse in general.
Sure. Well, there's a number of examples. We could run through a list, but I'll just start with, a recent one and perhaps one that the American people will pick up on and notice really easily. We moved our U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in Israel. That's a decision that had been pondered by presidents for the last 2 or 3 decades. And for whatever reasons at the time, they chose not to. I think one of the obvious reasons they chose not to was because we were dependent upon the Middle East for the provision of oil so that we could run our economy here in the United States. The fact that we are now the world's largest producer of oil and gas, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia, gave this president and perhaps future presidents who choose to continue this type of energy policy, one that produces enormous amounts of energy here at home, those types of foreign policy options, the freedom to make those decisions. And that's what, I read in a few of the papers just more recently. That's really what, energy security means at the end of the day, is that you're secure and you're independent from those types of actions that others would take in reaction to whatever foreign policy decision you want to make. Another one that comes to mind immediately is, the conversations that we've been having in Europe. Europe is obviously an enormous trading partner for us. We trade not only energy, but we trade, manufactured goods. And, as we look at what Europe has done over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades, our view is that they've become more dependent upon Russia for the provision, especially of natural gas. Our ability to come in to the European marketplace and the European Commission and the European Union and have very straightforward, rational conversations about that dependency gives us an option with regard to that policy debate that we didn't have because we produce so much gas here and because we export gas now, and we can offer Europe options that didn't exist a few years ago. We can have a much different conversation about their energy needs. Those are just 2 quick examples. I'm sure there are many others that I'm missing right off the top of my head.
No, I think that's actually great. And I think that's actually a point that I know we've been making in various things that we've been doing, both publicly and in text. But certainly the energy dimension of foreign policy has changed dramatically over the last 10 to 12 years for the U.S. This is more of a for your information, but food for thought. We actually participate in training for foreign service officers from the State Department before they deploy. that is run by the Petroleum Equipment Suppliers Association. They do a tour through Houston to understand the energy landscape. And there's a lot of discussion about how things are changing around the world, and things are definitely different than they were just a couple of years ago. Various pressures are mounting to sort of drive everything in the context of energy transitions. But to a person, every one of those Foreign Service officers, before they go to their sort of new posts, they've typically been somewhere else, and they will talk about how different their job has become as a result of what's happening in the U.S. And one of the things they want to understand better is how things will evolve going forward, because it has a definite impact on them performing their duties. So without a doubt, that is something that is very real and very tangible. But that raises another point that I alluded to. The energy transitions discussion, which is robust. The Department of Energy, and this is kind of where I want you to go with this, does a lot of work through our national labs, funds a lot of research, looking at things like hydrogen, nuclear, carbon capture. There's a lot of different things that are going on through NREL, variety of renewable energy resources. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that and maybe discuss how it fits into the context. You mentioned, I'm paraphrasing here, but the all of the above that DOE actually has, right? And the U.S. actually has that strategy. So I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about the various research initiatives that DOE is engaged in to sort of really broaden the perspective of being an energy superpower into other dimensions aside from just oil and gas.
Sure. No, happy to do that, Ken. Thanks for pointing out the national laboratories. That's a little known fact to most Americans that we have 17 national laboratories that are run by the Department of Energy, and they do everything from energy research and development, basic science, to applied science in the case of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado, to weapons work. We run 3 national laboratories that are almost exclusively dedicated to our our nuclear weapons program, which we run here at the U.S. Department of Energy. But taking a step back, we obviously do oil and gas research, hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling. Some of the technologies we take for granted today actually began life here in one of our DOE laboratories. Now, George Mitchell and the private sector took it to levels we could never have imagined, but those technologies began life here at the U.S. Department of Energy. We continue that work at our National Energy Technology Laboratory, which is somewhat dedicated to fossil fuels. We have 2 facilities, one in Pittsburgh, one in West Virginia. They're working on things like carbon capture and utilization technologies. We know the technology works. We've been working with this for quite a few years. Our challenge now is to work with the industry to make it more economical, so that we can begin to deploy this important technology out into the private sector, and not just in facilities that use coal as a fuel source for the purposes of electricity generation or whatnot. But there are many in the natural gas industry who are looking at this important technology for the purposes of stripping the carbon off and perhaps selling it to others who would do enhanced oil recovery or other types of work in the field. The basic point there is that carbon is making a transition from a pollutant as defined under the Clean Air Act or the EPA regulations to perhaps a commodity that has value in the marketplace. So we're seeing that transition occur over a period of time, but that particular lab is working very hard on that. The other technologies that you mentioned, or the other fuel sources that you mentioned, are equally important to us. I just returned from the MIT Lincoln Lab, where I saw some brand new technologies that will make hydrogen perhaps much more efficient and perhaps much less expensive to produce. We're looking at a few technologies that use aluminum as a base energy source, where we pour a liquid over it and extract the hydrogen or capture the hydrogen as it expands from the aluminum. It looks to be a very efficient and cheap way to produce hydrogen. If we can scale that up, move from the bench scale to perhaps an economy-wide scale, we may have an important new fuel source going forward. It's also very clean. We're very engaged with technologies out in our renewable energy laboratory in Colorado to make things like solar energy much more efficient as well. I've said this a couple times publicly. I don't mean it to sound as harsh as it comes across, but the technologies that we see today in the solar field, the panels that you see on people's houses, can be likened to horse and buggy technology. It's quite old, and we're looking for the next generation of solar. So we're working with things like perovskites to make those panels much more efficient. Other work that we're doing in places like the Oak Ridge National Laboratory is looking at rare earth elements. When we think about renewable technology, we're very familiar with the challenges that it is. It's intermittent. If the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you don't have electricity, your lights don't come on because our battery technologies are not as advanced as they need to be. And what we're doing is we're working with Oak Ridge and a PNNL, which is Pacific Northwest Laboratory out in Washington State, to potentially extract some of the rare earth elements that we need for the next generation of battery technologies from coal. And if we can crack that important riddle, we will perhaps have created the irony of ironies in that coal becomes a potential savior for renewable energy in the future. So lots of work being done here at the department. And I failed to mention another important energy source, and that's nuclear technologies, where we're developing new fuels for smaller advanced microreactors that are accident tolerant and non-proliferant. So you can't have a Chernobyl type event with the newer fuels that we're creating, and you can't make a warhead out of the material as well. So very exciting times here at the department. There's a lot going on in those national laboratories.
So I want to pull on one thread first in what you just said, nuclear in particular, because there's actually a few questions that have come through from our audience related to nuclear power. It's a space that's pretty well understood by electrical engineers, and we know exactly what it can do, but it's also one that is fraught with concern over safety in particular. And we've seen, the ramifications of what an incident can bring in a country like Japan, which is heavily dependent on nuclear power. The accident at Fukushima has resulted in a sea change in that country with regard to its attitude towards that fuel. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the longevity of nuclear power, what's actually happening with respect to the U.S. nuclear fleet, where you think it is likely to go in the next couple of decades, and what role it can actually play in more broadly the context of energy transitions and grid stability.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited about the future of nuclear energy. I think it is changing, and I'm not going to shy away from acknowledging, the fact that it is changing. And what I mean by that is that, I think perhaps the days of the large facilities that we've seen built in the country, the 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatt, facilities that we've seen, their days may be numbered. I do think, though, however, what I just mentioned, we're at the very beginning. We're at the front edge of a new era in nuclear technology, where the reactors are much smaller and safer. As I mentioned just a minute ago, we're developing these fuels that are accident tolerant. And as the public begins to understand that, or becomes more familiar with that, and they recognize the fact that this is zero emissions technology, it's safe, it's non-proliferant, I think we'll start to see the consumer acceptance of this important fuel source go up. And it's important that it does. All of the nations of the world have set environmental goals for themselves. And it's unclear to me how any nation can really achieve those environmental goals without nuclear being a part of that mix. Today, as I said earlier, without the battery technologies, the grid scale battery technologies that might allow some of these renewable fuel sources to come online and serve us 24/7, we're going to be dependent upon baseload power, baseload electricity here in the country to offset the intermittency of those renewable technologies. So we can do that obviously with hydro or with coal or natural gas, which has become an incredibly cheap fuel source for us, or we can do it with a very clean fuel source that we know a lot about here at the Department of Energy, and that's nuclear. So I'm actually quite excited If I do have any concerns about the industry, it's the fact that we are perhaps retiring some of these facilities prematurely. Their life cycle, their lifespan is much longer than we see the retirement schedules that are presented to us. So I'm a little concerned about that. I think we're perhaps moving a little too fast in terms of retirement of these nuclear facilities. But overall, I'm very excited about the technology and the future of the industry.
That's actually a great thing to hear. Most people aren't aware that the U.S. has the largest nuclear fleet in the world, and it provides a significant portion of the power that we all consume. So it's an important fuel source. And I think what you just mentioned in terms of premature retirements or retiring, facilities without a suitable replacement, that can bear detriment for various environmental goals that states and that are held at state and federal levels. So one thing that we haven't touched on that definitely came through on the questions that have come across are related to energy efficiency. And I know DOE has some energy efficiency programs. I wonder if you could maybe expand on that, because one of the things, just to kind of get a little wonky, that I teach in my energy economics class is that efficiency is a virtual source of supply. It allows us to do more with less. So I've always viewed it as an incredibly important part of the energy portfolio, and one that, for whatever reason, isn't necessarily in the press as much, but it's very important. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what DOE is involved with on that front.
Sure. No, happy to do that as well. What we're trying to do and I'll come back to this point in just a minute. Something just crossed my mind, Ken, I'd like to just tell you about really quickly before we end the conversation on nuclear, or perhaps move beyond it. I'll fail to mention this. We just signed an agreement with an intergovernmental agreement with Poland. It's going to be ultimately a $40 billion deal if they purchase 6 of our reactors, and have already agreed to buy U.S. technology. So these are likely to be Westinghouse technologies, the AP1000 reactors. So before I forget, I just wanted to mention that, because again, I think it points to there is a bright future in the nuclear space. Perhaps, it will look different here in the United States, but around the world, people are still buying our technology and they want our technology. So I'm excited for them for that deal. With regard to energy efficiency, I think they go hand in glove. Energy efficiency, obviously, in my mind, goes hand in glove with the production of energy. And, as my father used to tell me when I was a kid, he wanted me to save whatever money I was earning, cutting grass or whatever I was doing. But he would always remind me that you can't save your way to wealth. You can't save your way to a comfortable future. You have to, at some point, earn the money. And it's the same thing with energy. We want to conserve, we want to be efficient with its use, but it doesn't mean that you can stop production of the energy. And I think when I look across the space today, I see some in the environmental community who would have us shut down our production and go exclusively toward the energy efficiency side of the equation. And again, while I think it's very, very important, I don't know that we can focus 100% on that side of the ledger. That being said, what we're looking at are appliance standards that continue to raise the bar in terms of efficiency. And I must say, when I look at a refrigerator today versus what my mom had in South Louisiana 40 years ago, the changes in technology have just been stunning, absolutely stunning. And we want to see that progress continue. That being said, we also want consumers to have choice in the marketplace. So if you choose, to, much like in the automobile industry where I came from, if you choose to drive an SUV because you have a need for that, you should be allowed to buy that product. I have 9 kids. We need big cars. So if I'm forced to buy a smaller electric vehicle, for instance, that just simply doesn't work for my family at this point in time. Same thing applies in the appliance standard world. We're looking to adjust the regulations that provide not only increases in technology or increases in standards for more energy efficient products, but also for the consumer to have choice. And that's been the approach that we're taking here at the Department of Energy.
That's very interesting. So we're not going to leave nuclear yet, because you brought up Poland, and that actually provides a nice connection to another sort of energy security issue for Europe that you alluded to in your opening remarks. But Poland, as you know, has a long-standing sort of deep-rooted history with Russia in particular. And its energy security concerns have driven, significant development of coal resources in the country, and aspirations to disconnect from Russia in many ways. It's, fueled a desire for U.S. LNG imports. Undoubtedly, it had a role in the nuclear deal you just referenced. But it also plays a role in the Polish stance, as well as some neighboring countries, towards Nordstrom 2, which is a pipeline that has been in the press a lot. I wonder if you could maybe comment on that in terms of the U.S. perspective on Nordstrom 2 and its energy security dimensions, and how that connects to what's going on with our allies in Eastern Europe.
Sure, happy to do that. We continue to oppose the construction of that pipeline because we don't view it as a commercial entity. We don't view it as the same way we would view an Exxon Mobil or a Shell or a BP or other private commercial entity pursuing this type of infrastructure development. Gazprom, as you know, is a state-owned enterprise. Russia has geopolitical interest here with the development of that pipeline, not economic interest. And, as you point out, Poland and Lithuania and other Baltic states have been very vocal in their opposition, and for good reason. If this pipeline is built along with a counterpart in the southern part of the European continent, another pipeline known as Turkstream, what the Russians have effectively done is cut off any transit through Poland or through Ukraine or other parts of that world, those countries. That denies them economic revenue. Today they receive transit fees for Gazprom gas moving through. And as a result, they become even more dependent upon others for economic activity. And in the case of Russia, they become almost wholly dependent upon Gazprom for the provision of gas. Now, Poland's taken some really good steps. They've developed an LNG import facility. Lithuania has done the same. And, they do that for energy security reasons, obviously, but they also do it for economic security and economic competitiveness reasons. As we've seen in places like Lithuania, the simple announcement that they were going to develop an LNG import facility forced Gazprom to reduce its pricing, in some cases by as much as 30%. So that was a tremendous advantage, for the consumers there. And I think we're going to see more and more of that type of activity. But from a national security standpoint, I don't think I could say it any better than what President Trump said at the recent NATO summit, when he asked, the Germans in particular, to explain why it is that they wanted American defense forces in Europe to protect them from the very people that they were providing economic security to, the Russians. They were buying Russian gas, and in our opinion, becoming too dependent upon that Russian gas. So I think it begs the question. I think it's an important question for not only Americans to ask, but for all allies, for all democratic countries in the world to ask those types of questions. And that's why we will continue to oppose this pipeline.
That's interesting. Yeah, and it's definitely been in the press, and there are a variety of opinions on Nord Stream 2, without a doubt. You just raised one, though, that made me smile when you talked about LNG into Lithuania. One of our graduate students actually wrote about that using a game theory approach before the facility was built, and was actually asked by the Lithuanian government to present her research, which went over really well. And it's sort of interesting to see how, as things transpired, as an economist, she got it right. So that's always fun to see. So that's why it made me smile when you mentioned Lithuania. That's great. Yeah. More generally go ahead. Sorry.
Is the paper still available? I'd love to read it.
It is. I'll make sure you get a copy of it when we're done. Yeah, so it was actually part of her dissertation. So she graduated a couple of years ago. But you commented there on LNG exports, sort of indirectly. You mentioned imports into Lithuania and Poland, but and you've referenced, obviously, the role that U.S. LNG has played in providing an alternative fuel source to our allies. In general, though, it's also providing additional fuel to the world, quite frankly. And our relationships that we develop, both through government, but also commercially, the individual companies that are involved in developing these relationships sort of go hand in hand, right? And one of the places around the world that has seen the most dramatic growth in energy demand and growth in gas demand for that matter over the last few years has been China. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the outlook for energy demand growth globally. China's still at a centerpiece of that discussion. But ultimately what that means for U.S. energy exports, LNG in particular, and how that actually plays against the, which in many ways is a bipartisan sort of sentiment that, China is a hegemon, and how U.S. LNG could prosper in a world where there's increasing restrictions on commercial dialogue between the U.S. and China.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Ken. Thanks for that. Look, I think the demand for LNG is going to continue to increase, not only in China, but places like India. I was privileged and honored, really, to travel with President Trump, to visit with Prime Minister Modi, to talk about their energy needs. And he was very explicit, and I'm going to see him again next week. He was very explicit about their need for natural gas. The things we take here for granted, natural gas in our homes for purposes of cooking meals, there are parts of India that they just don't have it. And it is one of their larger if not their largest environmental challenge today. So he is desperate to get cooking gas in every home in India. Quite a challenge, going to create quite a demand for LNG around the world. Now he has options. He's got Qatar and he's got other providers, but he is looking to the United States for the provision of that gas. And he mentioned a couple of different reasons. It provides him not only with energy, but also economic opportunity. The United States is not only a reliable supplier of LNG, but we're unique in the sense that we don't have destination clauses in our contract, meaning you can buy the gas today. Once it's on the open ocean, if the spot market changes its price and you see an economic opportunity to sell that gas, you have that option to do so. That's a unique opportunity for countries to not only serve their energy needs, but make money in the process. So I see a strong demand for U.S. LNG all around the world. Now, with regard to China, obviously, as we move past this pandemic and those economies begin to open up, we're going to see that demand shoot through the roof. And I'm looking at early numbers that give me that confidence to say that today. I mean, we're seeing these numbers, jump up, not exponentially, but they're jumping up at a very, very fast clip. It's important for us to help meet that demand. I think the trade negotiations are, they're difficult, as you might expect trade negotiations to be. But Ambassador Lighthizer and his team are now dealing from a position of strength. We have something to offer in the conversation rather than simply something, to beg for. Yes, we like their manufacturing prowess. Yes, we like some of these products that they make and they're brought here to this economy. It's a very important relationship for us to have. But it must be fair and it must be balanced. And one of the ways that we can do that and have these very candid conversations with the Chinese is that they need our energy and they want our energy. So we have leverage in these conversations that we didn't have 20 years ago. And that's important for us to remember as Americans. As we talk about energy production, I will point out that one of the important things that we have to do here in America is to continue to build out the infrastructure that's necessary to get the product from point A to point B. In many ways, we've solved the supply problem that we had. We can produce oil and gas here in America now. We do it in record numbers. Our challenge is actually getting that product to market. So as we look across the country and we see legal challenges to pipelines, as we see permitting challenges to export facilities, specifically on the West Coast in places like California, Oregon, and Washington, that presents us with a really big challenge. We can serve the China market. We can serve the Asian markets very, very efficiently if we were allowed to export that important product from the West Coast. We'd be so much more competitive than we are today. We're still competitive, but we'd be even more competitive if we could export from the West Coast. So we have our challenges there.
So you just brought up a point that kind of segues nicely into another question that came from the audience. Infrastructure. In many ways, that's, aside from people in the industry, it's probably the most underappreciated part of delivering energy services is the need for infrastructure that is both sufficient and reliable. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on some of the things that have been developing with regard to wind power, for example. Onshore wind has grown dramatically over the last 20 years, probably nowhere more so than in Texas. Texas faced its own challenge with getting that wind to market, which prompted the development of the competitive renewable energy zones, or the CREZ, which was a $7 billion transmission development, right? But it ultimately succeeded, right, in delivering that power to markets in eastern and central Texas. That's a little bit different than having conversations about interstate transmission or interstate pipelines, and how you actually integrate resources to provide a more competitive energy market across fuels. So here we're talking about pipelines, transmission, export infrastructure, everything. Given the way things are progressing, do you think that is a bellwether, if you will, for how energy markets regionally in North America and ultimately how we connect with the rest of the world might look 20 years from now? Or do you think there's going to be a rubber hits the road moment where ultimately we get past this stuff and we figure out how to coordinate and develop infrastructure in a much more efficient way? I'd love your thoughts on that one.
That's a great question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for you. I kind of like the rubber hits the road approach. It's something we have to address. I mean, look, I think, right now we have a lot of legal challenges that are coming, primarily from the environmental community who want to block things like pipelines. I talked recently as last week about, the legal case around the Atlantic Coast Pipeline on the East Coast. And, as I looked at that case and I looked at the reaction to it, for those who are not familiar with it, the two companies that were financing it, Duke Energy and Dominion Energy here in North Carolina and Virginia, respectively, they made a decision after a very lengthy legal battle to withdraw from the project and simply announce that they weren't going to build it. And there were moans and groans on one side of the aisle, there were cheers on the other side of the aisle, and when I took a step back and I looked at it, I couldn't quite figure out the cheers that were coming from the environmental community, because what they were in essence doing was ensuring that a few coal facilities on the East Coast were going to continue to operate. This natural gas pipeline would have perhaps replaced some of that more carbon intensive fuel sources that were being used. So I didn't understand the victory that they were describing in their own mind. With regard to the rest of the infrastructure, however, I do think there's going to be a moment in time where the activists right now who are denying the types of pipeline projects that we see coming online may have a shift in gears as we begin to talk about electricity and transmission of electricity across the country. As we think about the grid in America, it's time for us to have a serious conversation about upgrading it. Not only to protect it from things like cyber attacks, but to upgrade it to accommodate the new generation sources that are coming online. We've talked in the past about moving electricity from places like Arizona, where there's a lot of solar power, to New York City, where they have a bigger load. We need to have an honest conversation about that. And I hope that in that conversation, the permitting processes that might come along with that type of transmission network would be different. And if they're not different, I'll toss something else out there that's a little bit blue sky. So don't run too far with it, because we mentioned earlier about some of the work that we're doing in the national laboratories. I'm aware of at least two projects in our national laboratories that potentially we can see a day where you can transmit or you can transport electricity without a wire. So if we think about that world where, we can move solar power or wind power from parts of Texas into Chicago, perhaps, or we can move nuclear power from the mid-Atlantic states to Chicago or perhaps other parts of the country without a wire. There may not be a need for permits. There may not be some of these legal battles that we're currently seeing across the country. It would be a very interesting world in which to live.
Yeah, that's a very sort of next gen sort of discussion, without a doubt. But nothing when it comes down to innovation has ever really surprised me. I've actually stated before that the next great innovation is in the mind of a 4-year-old somewhere playing with Legos, right? And I hold to that, right? I really do believe that probably the best way to envision a brighter future is to make sure everybody has an opportunity to express their own creativity in their own way. A question just came through that is actually linked directly to the infrastructure issue. And I want to come back to wind in just a minute, but LNG, the Northeast is sort of known for basis blowouts that occur in the winter when you have a polar vortex come through, right? And it gets really cold in the Massachusetts or the New England area, right? And you end up constraining existing pipeline capacity to get natural gas into the region for electric load and for home heating and space heating more generally. And so you have to import LNG. One of the most remarkable things that happened probably in the different times I've been to the Hill to testify is there were a number of questions lobbed, and this is going back, I think, about 1.5 years now, the last time I was there, about a Russian cargo that offloaded at the Everett terminal in Boston. And how could that happen? And it sort of raises all sorts of interesting, questions. Well, it happens because you don't have enough pipeline capacity to meet that peak demand. There's no native storage capability, and that's a geologic issue. But you then have to turn to the external market, right? The waterborne market.
Sure.
The Jones Act, and we don't have to get into that one. We've actually written some stuff on the Jones Act, but it prevents, cargo loadings at Sabine Pass and delivering in Boston. So you have to turn to the foreign market. And it just so happened that the cheapest, most available source at that point in time was a cargo of Russian molecules that had reloaded, I think, at the Isle of Grain in the UK and delivered. That, of course, set off all kinds of, fire alarms in Washington, as you might imagine, because you're talking about Russian gas. But it begs a really simple question that connects directly to this energy security, national security discussion, right? Will New England forever sort of be trapped in that space where they're reliant on LNG imports? Or do you think there will come a time when energy infrastructure more generally, doesn't have to be natural gas pipelines. It could be, a new fuel source, but something happens that can actually enable development so that energy security element, that national security element is really cemented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's coming, Ken. The residents in the Northeast in particular pay some of the highest electricity rates in the country today. And I forget what the exact number is, but I know it's more than 30% more than the rest of the country does. And that economic pressure is going to, at least in my view, in the future, put pressure on regulators, put pressure on policymakers in that area to begin to move away from some of their current fuel sources. I think they have to. If they're going to continue to grow the economy the way they have in years past, in places like Boston, where a lot of high-tech firms have moved in over the years, they're just going to have to find energy to feed that level of growth in their economy. I think the issue for us, and you've alluded to it, and we've spelled it out in the past, you've got one state in New York who refuses to allow a permit for a pipeline that would bring that natural gas from the Marcellus Shale or the Utica very easily into the Northeast region. I was just in Pittsburgh about a week ago talking to some of the workers there, and they're anxious to develop that infrastructure. They're anxious for those jobs and that economic activity to occur in their region. I think the answer is very, very simple and very easy. but we have to address it. And I think the residents of the Northeast are going to address it because they're beginning to realize that they've limited their economic growth, and for the energy that they do have, they're overpaying. So we'll see some changes coming, I think, soon.
Yeah, it's an interesting part of the country. There's also another sort of tangential issue related to transmission capacity development. For example, connecting more robustly to hydro resources in Quebec, which could be used as a load balancing mechanism for offshore wind as it develops in New England. But it's difficult to site and build transmission even. So it's an interesting discussion. It'll be definitely one to watch over the next few years, without a doubt.
It is, and it's also important for us to recognize, that, we have to, in my view, we have to be somewhat careful if we choose that type of an approach. We have to look no further than California to see where ultimately it might lead if you choose not to have your own energy sources or not to have your own baseload energy sources. So while, in the most recent polar vortex that occurred in the Northeast, the Canadians, in many respects, saved the Northeast or saved Boston. They were just a few hours away from some pretty serious brownouts and blackouts. There may be a time in the future where the Canadians say, "Hey, we need our energy. We need to keep it here. We can't sell it to you today." And in that case, you end up with a situation like I think you have in California, where they're having some pretty significant challenges because they can't buy baseload power from places like Arizona and Nevada.
Yeah. I think we could spend easily an hour just on energy in the West in general. California, for all of its difficulties, has also pioneered some interesting things, particularly on the demand response front and efficiency front. So that's a topic unto itself, though, without a doubt. So wind. Thinking about some of the aspirations to develop offshore wind resources in the United States. And there's plenty of suitable locations if you just look at wind resource. How is that progressing, and where do you see that going in the next 10 to 15 years? If we just put sort of our long view on the situation, how do you think offshore wind will develop in this country?
I think eventually it'll get there. It's got some of the challenges that we just talked about. Permitting challenges. There are some in the country today who just don't want it off of their shores, and as a result, those permits have not been granted, and some of these projects have been delayed quite a few years, and those costs tend to mount up, and companies will eventually move away if those permits aren't granted at some point. So, we see that up in the Northeast in particular. We saw that in places like Massachusetts and New York, where it's difficult to get the permit. So that's one challenge they face. What I'm starting to hear, though, from some in the industry is that the maintenance costs for the offshore facilities are a bit higher than what you would see for the onshore wind facilities. And that's creating a bit of an economic challenge for some of the countries. I know companies, I know one company in particular told me, very matter of fact, they said, "We're not going to touch it. It's just too expensive. It's not going to pay for itself in the time frame in which we have to have it pay for itself." So, and I asked them why, and that was the reasoning they gave me, was that the maintenance costs alone were somewhat challenging. That being said, I think those are issues that will be resolved. There'll be others who will step into that space. And if we can get the battery technologies or the storage capabilities for these types of energy sources fixed and to market efficiently, I think you'll see increased adoption of those. If you're not going to put a pipeline in New York or in Boston, if you're not going to have that infrastructure be built, then you have very few options left. And I think one of them is perhaps offshore wind for the production of electricity.
Yeah, that actually connects to something else that I know DOE is engaged in funding, which is looking at, in many ways, I don't like using the color codes when we talk about hydrogen, but it is what it is. There are some green hydrogen initiatives that DOE is involved in. One that's actually here in the state of Texas that GTI and the University of Texas are engaged in. And I think that's a really interesting pilot, if you will. basically, using wind power or renewable power to generate hydrogen through electrolysis and use that hydrogen to fuel a vehicle fleet, but also to fuel server farms. So, I think those are interesting ways to think about the future of energy, right? From a variety of different perspectives. So we're almost out of time. And so what I want to do is kind of follow up with a final question that kind of connects back to the theme of the discussion, which was security and national security. We recently held our annual energy summit, and we had views of the future of energy presented by the International Energy Agency and by BP. Sort of bracketed the summit. In both cases, they showed a very different future unfolding than what most people thought, even they thought just a year ago. And COVID had a lot to do with that. In terms of it being transformational, in terms of it providing opportunities for governments through recovery efforts to do various things on green energy fronts. But they also had lower growth overall, which I thought was interesting as well. And they pointed to a variety of things that, as drivers of that. In a world that's not growing as robustly, whether or not you believe that is really not relevant to the question. But in a world that's not, just think about it as construct a scenario. In a world that's not growing as robustly, maybe where trade tensions are high, maybe where a variety of geopolitical issues are front and center. How important does the U.S. become in that world where we're really talking about oil, natural gas exports, the development of new energy technologies through, the vehicles that we have in our national labs and those proliferating around the world in different ways? Do you see that world being one in which the U.S. loses its dominance or gains its dominance? Gains in dominance. That's a very big question, I understand, but I'm really just kind of asking you to kind of walk through that future, that prospective future, and kind of think about different dimensions the U.S. could play going forward.
Sure. That is a pretty broad question, pretty good question too. Look, I think as I think it through, I think we become more dominant in that type of world. I don't know that I want to advocate for a world in which we have lower demand for energy resources. I think it's the other way around. As I like to point out here in the United States, our GDP is important to us. Energy makes up a significant component of our national GDP, gross domestic product. But importantly, it's the first part of the GDP, at least in my opinion, because everything that we do in the economy is dependent upon the provision of energy in one way or another. So I would like to see the economy expand and have energy be an even larger part of it. I think if we were to face a world, though, in which we had a decreased economic activity, the United States becomes a larger player. Dr. Brouillette is a friend of mine at IEA. I don't know exactly what he presented to your organization, but he tells me that fossil energy in particular is going to be a large component of the world's energy source for the next 30 or 40 years, perhaps as far out as 2060. And if that's true, then the United States is very well positioned to provide that energy source to countries all across the world, as we talked about earlier. But I think importantly, it's not just the provision of the resource. It's not just the sale of LNG or the sale of coal or whatever energy source that we would make available to the open market. It's the provision of the technology that goes with it. It's what we talked about earlier, the development of CCUS, carbon capture technologies that we can sell along with the raw energy source of coal. It's looking at a coal generation facility that is much more efficient, perhaps combines some use of biomass so that you end up with a net negative carbon emission from that new facility. It's the sale of both the coal and that type of technology that I think the United States stands alone in our capability and in our ability to do. And if we're going to look at that, 20 years from now, if we're going to look at a world 20 years from now, I still see the U.S. being dominant in the energy space because of those reasons. We're blessed with an enormous amount of natural resources here, but we're also blessed with an enormous amount of innovation, not only in our 17 national laboratories, but in our private industry as well, and in the university systems that you are such a big part of. So I feel very confident about our energy future and our place in the world in the future.
Great. Well, with that, we're actually up against it. It's great to see you. I wish we could have done this in person. Maybe at some future date, we'll be able to do something in person, because your views are they're important. And it's great to hear your thoughts on a variety of issues that are important to the United States. So with that, I just want to extend a heartfelt thanks and, wish you all the best. And to all of our viewers, please stay safe, stay healthy. I think I got to most people's questions in a roundabout way, but if I didn't, happy to field those later. If desired, just reach out and let me know. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ken.